The thermometer hit 114 degrees that afternoon. It was August. The worst heat wave in 17 years had settled over upstate New York like a blanket you couldn't shake off. The forecast said it would hold for another 11 days straight. Up and down the valley, farmers were watching their fields turn brown. Their animals stood still in barns because moving meant burning energy they didn't have. Water bills were climbing. Stress was everywhere. But Sarah's orchard was alive. Not just surviving, thriving. Trees that should have been gasping for water stood with leaves still green and firm. The fruit hanging on the branches looked heavy and full. While the neighbors' apple trees 20 yards away showed signs of serious stress, Sarah's were drawing moisture from somewhere deeper. They were calm. They were ready. By the end of that heat wave, people had started to notice. And they wondered, how did a woman who'd been fired from her job less than 3 years earlier end up standing in a thriving orchard when everyone else's was dying? The answer didn't start with success. It started with failure. Sarah was 31 years old when she opened the email. It came on a Tuesday morning at 8:47 a.m. She remembers the time because she was sitting at her desk in an office on the 42nd floor of a building in Manhattan. The email said the position was being eliminated. They'd offer 2 weeks of severance and outplacement services. It was efficient. It was final. She packed a box. She took the subway home. The thing about being fired is that everyone asks what you did wrong, as if there's always something personal behind it. But Sarah hadn't done anything wrong. The financial services firm where she'd worked for 8 years had reorganized. Departments merged. Her entire team of 4 people was gone by 9:30 that same morning. She wasn't alone. That didn't make it easier. Her parents had retired 5 years earlier. They'd left New York after her father's heart attack, a warning, not a disaster. They'd bought land they'd always owned in a small town in the Hudson Valley, where Sarah's mother's family had lived for 3 generations. 43 acres. An old house built in 1952. And an apple orchard that was dying slowly. The orchard had been planted in 1987 by Sarah's grandfather. It had been beautiful once. But orchards don't maintain themselves. They require constant attention, pruning, disease management, soil care. Sarah's parents had kept it going at a basic level, but they didn't have the energy or knowledge for serious work. The trees were aging. Production had dropped to maybe 30% of what it used to be. The soil had gotten tired. It was the kind of orchard that most people would have cut down by now. Sarah had a brother named David. He was 2 years older. He lived in Boston where he worked in software development. He made good money. He had a wife named Rachel and 2 kids. He visited the property maybe twice a year, usually holidays. When the family talked about the orchard, David didn't say much. It seemed like something from the past. Something not worth the effort anymore. Sarah had always been different from her brother. She was quieter. She'd been the kind of kid who kept notes about things, observations. She'd had a journal where she'd written about weather patterns, what grew where on the property, how the animals behaved. She loved concrete problems with concrete solutions. She'd chosen finance because it paid well and because her parents wanted her to have stability. But she'd never loved it the way David loved his work. Now, at 31, sitting in the house she'd grown up in, Sarah looked out at 43 acres and an orchard that needed something. She didn't know what yet, but she knew she had time to figure it out. The severance money was enough to cover 6 months of living expenses if she was careful. Her parents weren't pushing her to leave. They were just relieved to have her there. Starting in September, Sarah did something her parents didn't entirely understand. She went to the bank and took out a small business loan. $12,000. It wasn't huge, but it was real money. It committed her to something. She didn't explain what the money was for, not really. When her mother asked, Sarah said, "The orchard. I'm going to try something." That was all. The word got around because small towns work that way. Sarah's mother mentioned it to her friend Janet at the grocery store. Janet mentioned it to her husband, who ran the local hardware store. He mentioned it to Tom Prescott, whose property bordered the orchard on the east side. Tom was 68 years old. He'd been farming all his life. He had strong opinions about what worked and what didn't. He'd watched the orchard decline over years. One afternoon in late September, he stopped by while Sarah was walking the rows, taking notes on a clipboard. "What's all this then?" Tom asked. "I'm working on the orchard," Sarah said. "To what end?" Tom asked. He wasn't being rude. That was just how he talked. "These trees are old, Sarah. The economics don't make sense anymore. You've got labor costs, input costs, disease pressure. Your margins are thin. Have been for 10 years. Why dump money into it?" Sarah looked at him. She didn't have a simple answer yet. Or rather, she had one, but she wasn't sure it was right. "I have a theory," she said finally. "I'm going to test it." Tom shook his head. "Theories don't pay bills, sweetheart." He meant well. But his skepticism hung in the air. The real beginning had happened 8 months earlier, back when Sarah still worked in Manhattan. She'd been waiting for a conference call to start, one of those meetings that runs late and gets rescheduled 3 times. While her calendar loaded, she'd clicked on a video someone had shared in a workgroup chat. It was about regenerative agriculture. A farmer in Vermont talking about how he'd rebuilt his soil by changing everything about how he managed his land. No heavy machinery in the off-season. Cover crops planted in fall. Reduced tillage. Targeted pruning based on plant physiology, not just tradition. It had seemed interesting in a distant way. Sarah had watched 2 minutes, then closed it. But it had stuck with her. In late September, after Tom left, Sarah made a phone call. She found an agricultural extension office in the county. She explained what she was thinking about, salvaging an old apple orchard. They connected her with a consultant named Dr. Elena Vasquez. Elena was 54. She'd spent 30 years working with orchardists. She believed in what she called working with the tree's intelligence rather than against it. She'd helped dozens of small orchards improve production by fundamentally changing how they approached soil, pruning, and water management. They met on a Saturday morning in early October. Elena was smaller than Sarah expected, with short gray hair and hands that knew how to feel soil. She walked through the orchard without speaking for 20 minutes. She knelt down. She pulled back leaf litter. She examined bark. She tasted soil, actually put a bit in her mouth and chewed it thoughtfully. "Your grandfather planted these well," Elena said finally. "Good varieties. Good spacing. But for 30 years, you've been managing them like you're trying to keep them controlled. Pruning everything back. Treating soil like it's dead. Preventing natural growth cycles. How do I fix it?" Sarah asked. Elena explained it carefully over 2 hours, sitting on the porch steps with coffee that had gone cold. "Here's how it works. Apple trees don't just need water and sunlight. They need a complex soil ecosystem. The best soil for orchards is alive, full of mycorrhizal fungi, beneficial bacteria, and organic matter. These organisms form symbiotic relationships with tree roots. They help the tree absorb water more efficiently. They make the tree more resilient in drought. They help prevent disease. When you till the soil heavily every year, or use bare soil management, you destroy that ecosystem. You're resetting it annually. The trees have to constantly rebuild connections instead of deepening them. But if you leave the soil largely undisturbed, cover it with mulch and cover crops, stop heavy machinery in the root zone, and prune strategically to encourage the tree's natural form rather than force it into an artificial one, then the soil ecosystem can deepen. It becomes more complex. And that complexity makes the tree stronger. It takes time. Trees are patient. Elena's approach meant 3 core changes. First, stop tilling and start using deep mulch and cover crops. Second, prune much less aggressively, removing only what's truly needed. Third, reduce chemical inputs dramatically and let the natural system do more of the work. "But here's what people don't understand," Elena said. "The first year, it might look worse before it looks better. The trees might produce less fruit. You're resetting their expectations. You have to be patient." "How much worse?" Sarah asked. "Could be 50% of normal production," Elena said. "Could be more. Depends on the trees. Depends on how sick the soil is." Sarah thought about Tom's skepticism. About the loan she'd taken out. About 6 months of living expenses running down. "That's my risk," she said. Elena smiled. That's your bet. Sarah started in October 2021. She hired 2 part-time workers, Miguel and James, both experienced with trees. She bought wood chips by the truckload. She bought seeds for a winter cover crop. She started pruning differently, following Elena's guidance. Remove deadwood, remove branches crossing each other, thin crowded areas, but leave the overall structure of the tree more natural. She did about 40% of the pruning herself, learning by doing. By December, she'd treated 197 trees. The work felt right. Elena visited in November and gave feedback. "You're thinking about this correctly," she said. "You're looking at the tree as a whole system, not just production units." But in March, Sarah noticed something wrong. A section of her newly pruned trees, maybe 30 of them in the southern block, had branches that weren't putting out new growth like they should have. The buds looked weak. When she'd pruned them, she'd removed too much. Nearly 40% of the canopy in that section was gone. The trees were stressed. She called Elena in a panic. "Show me," Elena said. They drove to the orchard on a cold Saturday. Elena walked the affected section silently. Then she knelt and looked at the cut sites. Her expression didn't change. "You pruned too aggressively," she said. "You removed 40, maybe 45% of the canopy. These trees were already stressed from years of poor management. That much removal at once is too much shock. You forced them into survival mode instead of recovery mode." "So they're dying?" Sarah asked. "No. But they'll be slower to recover. You'll lose a year." Sarah's chest went tight. That year mattered. That year was her hypothesis proving itself or proving false. A lost year meant burning through her capital faster. Meant more doubt. "What do I do?" she asked. "You learn," Elena said. "You pruned these trees like you were trying to reshape them overnight. But regenerative work isn't about force. You prune 30% maximum, especially on stressed trees. You do it across multiple years. You're undoing 35 years of damage. Respect that." The next month was hard. Sarah felt foolish. She felt like Tom had been right. She felt like she'd wasted money and time. She also kept going. She adjusted her approach. On the remaining 167 unpruned trees, she was much more conservative. She removed deadwood, removed branches obviously competing. But she left the tree architecture mostly intact. She was pruning for health, Elena said, not for shape. Elena came to the property twice in spring. She helped Sarah understand what to look for, how to read a tree's growth history in its branch patterns, how to know if a branch was stressed or strong, how the angle of a branch determined whether it would be productive. "You're learning to listen to what the tree is telling you," Elena said one afternoon in May, standing in front of a 35-year-old tree. By June, Sarah had a realization. The trees she'd pruned conservatively in February, the ones she'd left mostly intact, were putting out vigorous new growth. The branch tips were bright green and strong. Meanwhile, the over-pruned southern section was still lagging. It confirmed what Elena had been saying. The trees knew how to grow. You didn't have to force them. You just had to give them the right conditions and get out of their way. The first year ended up being a reset year, just as Elena had predicted. Fruit production in 2022 was about 40% of what it had been in 2020. By weight, that meant Sarah harvested roughly 8,400 pounds of apples across the property. The previous average had been about 21,000 pounds. But the quality was noticeably better. The fruit was larger. The color was deeper. The skin was healthier, fewer marks and blemishes. Sarah sold most of it to a local co-op and a pick-your-own operation. She made $14,800 in revenue. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough to cover her costs, her salary, or the interest on her loan. But it was real fruit from trees that had been struggling. And the trees themselves looked different. Healthier. Calmer. More importantly, the soil was starting to change. Where she'd put down mulch and planted cover crops, the earth was turning darker. In late August, when she dug a small hole to check on root development, she could see fine white mycorrhizal threads connecting tree roots to the soil. That was the fungal network. That was the ecosystem rebuilding. Elena visited in September 2022. 1 year, she said, walking the orchard. This is real progress in 1 year. Winter 2022 was mild. The trees handled it well. Spring 2023 came with hope. But spring also came with problems. The first one appeared in late April. A hard frost hit overnight. Temperatures dropped to 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Sarah had been monitoring the forecast, but the frost came earlier than predicted. It hit during bud break, right when the trees were most vulnerable. She drove through the orchard that morning checking damage. In the southern block, the section she'd over-pruned, about 60% of the emerging buds were dead. Those trees were still recovering. They couldn't handle another shock. But in the main section, damage was maybe 15 to 20%. Not ideal, but manageable. Elena called when Sarah texted her photos. The trees with deeper root systems and healthier tissue can handle stress better, Elena said. Your work in the soil is protecting them. The weak trees, the ones you're still bringing back, they're more fragile. It was hard to see, but it was also a lesson. The regenerative approach was creating resilience. The second obstacle came in early June. A herd of deer, maybe 30 of them, found the orchard and discovered it was a salad bar. They came for 3 consecutive nights and stripped bark off branches. Browsed on new shoots. Damaged maybe 15% of the new growth across the property. Sarah had to act. She worked with a local wildlife control officer to understand the patterns. Deer have territories. They usually move on if a place becomes unwelcoming. She bought fencing materials and put up electric fencing around the perimeter. The initial cost was $4,200. There was another loan conversation with the bank. It's the right thing, the loan officer said finally. Fencing is an asset. It'll protect your crop for years. By late June, the deer were gone. They'd moved to another area. The third obstacle was market-related. Sarah had connected with a grocery chain in the area, 16 stores, mid-range market. They'd agreed to carry her apples starting in fall 2023. It was a bigger opportunity than the co-op. Sarah had projected it would double her income to maybe $30,000. In August, the grocery chain went through a corporate change. The new buyer had different requirements. He wanted year-round supply commitment and liability insurance that would cost Sarah $800 per month. The contract was off. She was back to the co-op and the pick-your-own operation. When she told her parents about it, sitting at the kitchen table one evening in late August, she felt the weight of it. She'd been at this for 2 years. She'd burned through most of her severance. She'd taken 2 loans totaling just over $16,000 combined. The orchard was improving, but the economics were still tight. Her mother squeezed her hand. You knew this was going to be hard, didn't you? Knowing it and living it are different things, Sarah said. Tom Prescott came by again in September, the way he did most falls. His trees had produced well that year. He was selling to the same co-op, making good money from a steady crop. So how'd your experiment go? He asked. He was genuinely curious now. Less skeptical. Better than year 1, Sarah said. Trees are healthier. But the numbers still aren't great. Give it time, Tom said, and he meant it. That surprised her. But something else was shifting by late September 2023. There had been a dry summer. Irrigation systems were working overtime in most orchards in the region. Farmers were talking about water costs being unsustainably high. The normal annual rainfall for the region is about 42 inches. That year they got 28 inches through September. The wells were running low. Sarah's property had gotten through it okay. The mulch layer and the cover crops were holding moisture better than bare soil. The trees were using water more efficiently because the healthier soil ecosystem was more efficient at nutrient and water transport. She wasn't running her irrigation system as hard as her neighbors. One afternoon, Tom stopped by and asked to walk the orchard. Your trees don't look stressed, he said. The soil is holding water, Sarah explained. We're not tilling, so there's organic matter that acts like a sponge. How'd you get so smart about this? Tom asked. I read everything. I have a consultant. And mostly I paid attention, Sarah said. He was quiet for a moment. That deer fence must have cost you, he said finally. $4,200, Sarah said. Huh. He was thinking about it. I've had the same deer problem. Been thinking about fencing. But I didn't know if it'd work. It works, Sarah said. By October, Tom was asking detailed questions about cover crops, about mulch, about pruning angles. The skepticism had shifted to curiosity. The forecast for the summer of 2024 was ominous by mid-June. El Niño conditions were building. The Weather Service predicted a heat wave and potential drought. By late June, 3 weeks into a stretch of temperatures above 95 degrees, it was clear this wasn't a typical dry spell. The heat held through July. The rainfall that should have come in mid-July just didn't appear. By August, the region was running on fumes. Streams dried up. Wells were dropped to reserve status. Farmers started talking about financial loss. Tom's orchard was suffering visibly by mid-August. His trees, on bare soil with no cover crops, were under severe stress. Some of the older trees started showing signs of drought stress, leaves going slightly dull, earlier than normal leaf drop. He was running his irrigation system constantly, and his water bill was approaching $3,800 for the month. The county declared a drought emergency on August 9th. Sarah's orchard looked different. The trees still had vibrant green leaves. The fruit was sizing well. The new growth was strong. The mulch layer was holding moisture. The extensive root systems, developed over the past 2 years in living soil, were drawing moisture from deeper in the earth where it was still available. On August 13th, during the peak of the heat wave, a local news crew came to the orchard to film a story about drought impact in the region. They were going to interview 2 farmers, one struggling, one succeeding. That farmer who was succeeding was Sarah. They filmed her walking through her orchard. They filmed the full, healthy leaves. They filmed Tom Prescott sitting in his truck, looking at his stressed trees, talking about the economics of intensive irrigation. "I'm pumping water at a cost I can't sustain," Tom said on camera. "Some of my trees may not make it through this. I might lose a quarter of my crop." Then they filmed Sarah. "The soil is the key," she said simply. "If you build the ecosystem, the trees can take care of themselves. They pull what they need from deeper sources. They're efficient." The segment aired 2 days later. By the following week, Sarah's phone had started ringing. By October 2024, Sarah had 23 inquiries from other farmers wanting advice. She didn't have a consulting business. She wasn't interested in that. But she agreed to meet with a few people. She walked their properties. She explained what she'd learned. She connected 3 of them with Elena. Tom came by in late October with a plan. He wanted to try the approach on 10 acres of his land, about a third of his orchard. He wanted to bring in cover crops in the fall. He wanted to mulch. He wanted to prune differently starting in spring. "I can't afford to fail completely," he said. "But I can afford to experiment." "That's exactly what I did," Sarah said. Her orchard harvest in 2024 was 14,200 pounds. The revenue came to just over $38,000. After expenses, water, labor, equipment maintenance, loan payments, she netted $11,400. It wasn't rich, but it was sustainable. It was a business. She paid back the smaller of her 2 loans entirely. The orchard had been producing more fruit each year. 2021, the first year she took over, before her work approximately 20,000 pounds from the property overall, but stressed and declining. 2022, after her intervention and over-pruning error, 8,400 pounds, but healthier trees. 2024, 14,200 pounds, growing toward the original production level but with better quality and resilience. But the question that had hung unanswered since the beginning, the one implicit in everything she'd done, finally had an answer. When her parents asked her that evening, sitting on the porch as the sun went down, "Are you staying?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. "This is what I'm doing." Her father smiled. He didn't say much. He just nodded. He'd been worried she would eventually go back to the city. Now he knew she wouldn't. David visited the following month with Rachel and the kids. Sarah showed them the orchard. David asked the same practical questions Tom had asked 2 years earlier. Sarah answered them without defensiveness. She showed him the numbers. She showed him the trees. She didn't try to convince him. She just showed him what was true. "This is really impressive," he said finally. And he meant it. By the spring of 2025, Sarah had started exploring value-added products, pressing apples into cider, making vinegar, developing a small direct-to-consumer brand. She wasn't expanding aggressively. She was building thoughtfully. The orchard at the end of the third year wasn't famous. It wasn't written up in major agricultural publications. It wouldn't be a viral sensation. But it was thriving. It was profitable. And it was becoming a model that other people in the region wanted to understand. Sarah often thought back to that moment on the 42nd floor, opening an email that fired her. She'd been so afraid that day. She'd felt like a failure. But that email had opened a door that an ordinary life never would have. She understood now what Elena had been trying to teach her from the beginning. The biggest transformations come not from forcing everything into a new shape overnight, but from creating the right conditions and trusting the time it takes.